Pregnant again, how utterly disappointing. Mara's words sliced through the tense silence like a butcher's knife. My stomach dropped as I slowly looked up from my plate at my mother-in-law's sneering face. Even shifted uncomfortably beside me, but stayed silent as usual. Mara continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Another daughter, I assume. When are you going to give my son the heir he deserves? I felt the blood drain from my face as the weight of her words slammed into me. This was supposed to be a joyful celebration dinner for my pregnancy, but Mara had once again managed to turn it into a humiliation. Mother, please, Evan finally muttered, but she waved him off dismissively. Don't mother me, you're just as frustratingly submissive as your father was. If you don't control your wife, she'll keep popping out these disappointing female placeholders. Tears stung my eyes as I finally found my voice. Zoe is not a placeholder. She's our beloved daughter, and this pregnancy is still early. We don't know the sex yet. Oh, spare me, Mara. Rolled her eyes at your atrocious track record. It's clearly another girl, you're a broodmare failure. The venom in her tone shook me to my core. Evan's head hung low, crushed by his mother's verbal lashing. Hurt and rage burned inside me, but I knew defending myself was futile against this woman's cruelty. I need some air. I managed to choke out, pushing back from the table. I had to escape before breaking down completely. Mara scoffed as I rushed away, running away again. Are we typical? I hurried out to the back patio, gulping in the cool night air as burning tears streaked my cheeks. How could she be so hateful and demeaning toward me? Footsteps approached, and I tensed, steeling myself for another barrage of insults. But it was Evan, his face etched with sadness and apologetic. Lena, I'm so sorry, she was completely out of line back there, he said softly, taking my hand. You know how important you and the kids are to me. Don't listen to her vitriol. I pulled my hand away, suddenly angry at his pity, but I did listen. Even for 8 years, I've listened to her constant put downs and cruelty toward me, toward Zoe. When are you finally going to stand up to your mother? Evan's eyes widened, then quickly averted. You know how she is, she'll never change, he mumbled weakly. I felt something inside me hardened at his words. For the first time, I truly saw Evan's inability or unwillingness to protect me from his mother's abuse. In that moment, the illusion of our marriage began cracking before my eyes. As I looked into my husband's beaten, submissive stance, I realized with sinking dread that this pattern would never end. Mara's iron grip over him was unbreakable, and I was the perpetual target for her destructive need to dominate. Wily, I turned and headed back inside, leaving Evan standing alone with his spineless excuses. I sensed this was the beginning of an inescapable downward spiral that would alter my family forever if only I knew then just how devastating the consequences would be. The tension hung thick in the air as Mara smoothed her silk blouse, a self-satisfied smirk playing across her lips. Lena, my dear, I have some news that might shake things up a little. I eyed her tiredly from across the kitchen counter. What are you talking about? She started off with a mockingly sympathetic tone, saying, a daughter is lovely, but it simply won't do for carrying on the family legacy. I knew that any protest against this woman's twisted agenda would be futile, so I took matters into my own hands to help resolve this delicate issue. I introduced Evan to a wonderful young woman named Sienna, who is devoted, fertile, and more unable to give him the son he deserves. The words hung in the air like a bad dream, but Mara's sneer told me that this wasn't a nightmare, it was disgustingly real. Depravio, don't be so dramatic, she scoffed. I'm doing what's best for my son's future. The casual cruelty of her words struck me like physical blows. How could anyone be so utterly lacking in human empathy, you cruel, manipulative hag? I cried out, unable to contain my anger any longer. Does Evan even know about this vile scheme? A slow, satisfied smile spread across Mara's face. Why don't you ask him yourself, dear? Evan stepped into the room flanked by a slim, overly made-up woman I didn't recognize, Sienna. I presumed the look of sheepish contrition on my husband's face said it all. You allowed this. Your own mother brought another woman into our marriage to bear your child, I stammered, feeling the world crumbling around me. Evan couldn't meet my eyes. Lena, we've talked about how important carrying on the family line is, so you're just going to let your mother pimp out some cheap to get what she wants. I screamed, uncaring of the foul language as blinding rage took over. Sienna's eyebrows shot up in feigned indignation. Evan finally looked at me, his expression hardening to match his mother's callous demeanor. This is for the greater good. Lena, my duty as a man, if you were able to do your willy duties properly, we wouldn't need to go to such extremes. His cold, rehearsed words lanced through my heart like daggers. This was really happening. My own husband was utterly betraying me in the most humiliating way possible, all with his mother's enthusiastic support. Mara chuckled at my stunned silence. Don't worry, dear, once Santa properly breeds, you can focus your energy on my granddaughter. We wouldn't want you feeling completely useless. Her words ignited an indescribable fury within me that I never knew I possessed with a primal scream. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and hurled it with every ounce of strength. It struck Mara squarely in her smug face, shattered viciously, and sprayed blood and ceramic shards across the room. Sienna shrieked in horror as Mara crumpled to the floor, clutching her. Ruined face and howling in agony, chest heaving, I turned to face Evan and saw the shock and fear in his eyes in that unrestrained moment. I knew that our marriage had fallen apart into ashes, and there would be no forgiveness for this ultimate betrayal. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air as Evan stared at me with a mixture of shock and fear, while Sienna shrank back, clearly shaken by my outburst, but still clinging to her role in this sick charade. I'll see you arrested for this assaulting me in my own home, your home, I scoffed, unable to contain the sudden resurgence of fury rippling through me. This is my home, the home I made with my husband, the man you're trying to pimp out behind my back like some kind of degenerate mother pimping monster. Mara opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a raised hand. No, don't even try denying it, you hateful crone. I heard everything about how you willingly brought this woman into my marriage explicitly to cuckold your own son. I turned my fiery glare to Evan, who flinched as if struck. And you spineless coward, going along with your mother's demented plans, ready to stick your dick into the first fertile wand she picks for you. Lena began weakly, but I wasn't about to let him make pathetic excuses. Did you really think I wouldn't find out that I'd just be a good little wifey while you knocked up some cheap hussy on the side? Hey, Santa's shrill voice cut in, her fake-baked face contorting with indignation. I am not some hussy. Your bastard husband came on to me. I whirled on the overly made-up woman, feeling a cruel smile spread across my face. Did he now? So tell me when you were spreading. Your legs for a very married man. Did you stop to think about his innocent family? You were helping to destroy them. Sienna opened her mouth, but nothing came out deep down, even though she realized how reprehensible her role was in this arranged scheme. Darkly, I turned back to Evan. I gave you everything, a beautiful child, a loving home, an amazing life, and you were willing to just throw it all away to appease your mother's insane breeding fetish. Mara glared up at me, her face already beginning to grotesquely swell from the vase impact. You are the only one responsible for this. You are infertile enough, I roared, slamming my fist down on the counter hard enough to make them all jump. I've had enough of your bottomless well of cruelty and manipulation. If having a son is so important, then Avon is welcome to it. I snatched up a pen and a sheath of papers, thrusting them toward Avon with a burning separation agreement. You can have your son situate your freedom to breed some new little hairs with that plastic surgery disaster over there. Evan gaped, stunned into silence. Even Sienna seemed jolted by my actions as the gravity of the situation sank in. Well, I demand you, through gritted teeth, sign it and get out. Take your vile, treacherous mother and your stupid son quest and just go. I want you out of my house, out of my life. Slowly, numbly, Avon took the pen and stared at the agreement. A heavy pause seemed to blanket the room as Mara and Sienna looked on with matching expressions, a mixture of surprise and sickening satisfaction. Then, with a trembling hand, Avon scrawled his name in harsh strokes across the papers, officially ending our marriage in that single callous gesture as his mother had always intended. Exhaling hard, I snatched the signed pages back from his hand, our eyes locking in one last searingly intense glare. Then I turned and walked upstairs without another word, clutching the proof of my broken world and wondering how I would ever be able to piece my shattered life returned to normal. But after the confrontation, Avon and his mother stormed out, taking their co-conspirator Sienna with them. An eerie silence fell over the house I once considered to be my loving home, and I struggled to process the devastating implosion of my marriage. I knew that signing those separation papers was the only way to deal with Evan's unforgivable betrayal, but sometimes the overwhelming sense of loss threatened to overwhelm me. One evening, as we ate dinner in silence, Zoe, our 8-year-old daughter, seemed to pick up on the heavy tension despite my best efforts to shield her. She asked, "Mommy, where did Daddy go?" And I froze, unprepared for the question. Need to breed in hair with another woman, but I couldn't bring myself to shatter her innocence so completely. Daddy had to go away for a little while, honey. I hedged, struggling to keep my voice steady. Work things out, Zoe frowned, clearly picking up on my emotional disquiet. Ever the empath, just like her mother. Are you sad, Mommy? Did you and Daddy have a fight? Something like that, baby, I managed, fighting back the lump swelling in my throat, but everything will be okay, I promise. The lie tasted like ashes on my tongue because in that moment there was no way to see how anything could ever be okay again. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. Zoe looked up, eyes wide with something like hope. Is that Daddy? Stay here, sweetie, I said quickly, rising to answer the door with trepidation curling in my stomach, but it wasn't Evan on the other side. Instead, a sharply dressed man in an expensive suit stood with a crisp folder in his hands. Mrs. Reading, he asked brusquely without preamble. I'm Mr. Collins, an associate of your husband's, an icy fist. I felt my heart sink as I realized that this was not just a simple divorce agreement. It was Evan and his demon-possessed mother using their wealth and power to take away everything from me, including my home, my life, and my child, all in the ruthless pursuit of their deranged male hair vendetta. Mr. Collins continued all business as he held out the folder, and I reluctantly accepted the heavy stack of documents, fearing that this was the end of my marriage after Evan's sickening betrayal. Reading Mr. Collins stated flatly after that my client will pursue more aggressive recourse if you fail to comply. The unmistakable threat laced his words like arsenic memories, flashed of the unrestrained violence that ran in Mara's virulent veins, the bludgeon of her unstoppable quest to destroy any obstacle to the grandchild she craved. My treacherous, spineless husband had clearly thrown in with his vile mother. He would stop at nothing to cut me out of his life, completely, all for the unforgivable sin of bearing him a daughter instead of a son. A cold, dead feeling settled over me, the final vestige of our broken marriage crumbling to bitter ash. There would be no more tears, no more desperate pleas or self-delusions. I was truly and utterly alone now, except for my innocent little girl watching in sad confusion from the next room. The pure, bright spirit that was supposed to be my greatest joy. But in that stark moment, she became my sole lifeline, my unbreakable reason to endure the coming. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim determination because I knew that time was running out before Evan and Mara tried to take away everything I held dear. First, I secured a shark of a divorce attorney, Caroline Weston Steely, who was aggressive and known to devour entitled, rich husbands like Evan. I told Mr. Collins, my jaw rigid, that after 48 hours he can expect to hear from my attorney. I said in a toneless rasp because I'll be damned if I let him take my daughter too. Caroline said, we're going to crucify this bastard in his mother's meta, with a cold rage. After I told her all the details, I began to gather ammunition and any evidence of Evan's wrongdoing that could be used against him in the upcoming war. I looked through financial records and found that his company had been transferring funds to an offshore account for years, engaging in embezzlement and tax evasion, which could be considered criminal behavior if exposed. Finally, I made arrangements for Zoe's temporary relocation while the legal battle raged. My sister, an elementary school teacher, lived 2 states away, and I knew she could take care of my sweet daughter while I fought in the trenches. When the 48-hour deadline came around, I was ready, or as ready as I could be. I slid the signed divorce petition across the table, but not the one he provided. Caroline Weston's imprint was on the stack of papers, and every word was carefully negotiated for maximum impact. Mr. Collins' eyes flashed with surprise as he scanned the unrecognized document, his brows knitting in disapproval. I said coldly, I refuse to be bullied or stonewalled. Every nefarious act, every awful betrayal, has consequences. I slid the thick dossier of financial documentation across the table, watching Mr. Collins's face blanch slightly as he realized the implications. Your client's illegal corporate dealings have been rigorously cataloged by very credible forensic accountants. Evans's ego and insecurity about his business reputation were thinly veiled weak spots, traits that his vile mother had eagerly exploited countless times. Now it was my turn to wield that leverage. As he studied the documentation, Mr. Collins maintained an impressively impassive poker face, but a muscle in his jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. Perhaps he was already calculating how hard this battle could hit Evans's pocketbook. I will present this counteroffer to Mr. Collins. He said, finally, you see that you do have a tight contingent on these materials remaining discreet for now. I said simply, the meter is running on flaying his reputation and criminal liability wide open. Mr. Collins nodded, collected the documents, and left, clearly reeling from this unexpected turn of events. faintest spark of hope of reclaiming some portion of my life and dignity from Evan and Mara's grasping claws. But there was still one vital loose end to secure. Before the war began in earnest, I turned and gathered Zoe into my arms, fighting back fresh tears at her sad, bewildered expression. "Mommy," she said tremulously, "what's happening?" "I want Daddy to come home." I hushed her, gently stroking her soft hair. "I know, baby, I know, but you have to go stay with Auntie Nina for a little while. Okay, for your safety." Zoe's eyes widened slightly, picking up on the undercurrent of tension, but she nodded obediently as I clutched her tiny form. I silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect my daughter's well-being, even inscribing her name permanently in the chasm dividing our family. There would be hurt and confusion, but I hoped she would eventually understand, because in the end I would make absolutely certain that Evan and Mara paid the ultimate price for their monstrous transgressions. Once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The divorce battle broke out with a ferocity I could hardly have predicted. Evan and Mara were clearly offended by my refusal to give up and wanted to destroy me with all their resources. As dark secrets were brutally unearthed, accusations and exposures flew in both directions, and Mara launched a public smear campaign in which she painted me as an unfit mother and spouse who was jealous of Evan's business success. We retaliated by disclosing details of her deranged campaign to cuckold her own son for a male heir. It was a soul-destroying process, but I refused to give up even a single inch, kept afloat by my resolve to keep so stable. Eventually, after 6 agonizing months, cooler heads in Evan's camp prevailed in pushing for a negotiated settlement and an end to the scorched earth hostilities before any more radioactive scandals fully combusted. As our respective legal teams arrived, there was a hush that fell over the sterile conference room. Eve entered, shoulders squared, but her eyes hollowed from the protracted battle. Then, with a twisted sneer, I felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction that at least I had managed to get rid of Marlowe's unbearably smug exterior greetings. "We went straight to business, and my client is willing to offer a full and impartial distribution of legitimate marital assets as long as certain conditions are met," Caroline stated firmly, including the permanent renunciation of custodial claims over the minor child. I could feel Mara's glare burning a hole through me, but it was a necessary concession to ensure her safety and healing. Caroline didn't flinch, and she assured me that the unusual reproductive circumstances during the marriage remained sealed and undisclosed. Even shifted uneasily at the allusion, and Mara's scowl deepened. "Such terms are highly irregular." Their lead counsel responded stiffly, saying that we are amenable to the equity distribution provided indemnity against future potential actions. The ugly pause lingered because they knew that their financial skullduggery had been thoroughly exposed and that it could jeopardize not only Evan's business, but also possibly lead to his imprisonment. They had no choice but to negotiate suppression of the entire sordid truth. Of course, as long as commitments are kept, the matter will remain permanently sealed. Caroline said her shark-like smile was a bit too wide. The negotiation went on for hours, dividing enormous assets and investments down to the last decimal point. Ultimately, however, we hammered out an agreement that was secured by both sides of mutually sustaining silence. Mara looked completely miserable when faced with giving up control over her sons and Zoe's lives while still being outrageously wealthy. I knew that the concessions represented a profound personal defeat, which strengthened my resolve. Caroline told me in an undertone as the final paperwork was prepared, "Don't expect congratulations. The whole situation is equally sickening and infuriating, but you stood your ground and secured the best path for your daughter's well-being." I could only nod numbly, my strength finally waning after the marathon ordeal. There was no joy or catharsis, only the cold satisfaction of having survived this battle of enforcing some sort of consequences on Evan and Mara for their grotesque transgressions and guaranteeing a future of stability for Zoe. I met Mara's seething glare one last time, and you twisted evil, too tired even to revel in. Her impotent sputtering at the insult. I just stood and walked out, gathering the last of my dignity to forge a path into this new uncertain life. With the divorce settlement finalized and my financial future secured, I was finally able to focus on rebuilding my life and our life free from the toxic orbit of Evan and Mara. My first priority was reintegrating with Zoe. The poor girl had been moved between relatives for months, kept at a cautious distance from the legal battle raging between her parents. I could only imagine the confusion and hurt she must have felt when Na brought her home, and on that first day, Zoe ran straight into my arms, her little body trembling with soft sobs. My heart broke at her muffled cries. "I missed you so much, Mommy. I was so scared." "I know, baby," I soothed my own tears. She pulled back her young face, still so innocent but bearing a new heaviness. "But it's okay now. We're going to be okay." As I studied her deep brown eyes, which looked a lot like Evan's, I felt a lump form in my throat. How could I lie to her while also depriving her of hope? "Daddy can't be with us anymore, sweetheart." I managed carefully, and he made some decisions that went against what we believe is right. Zoe's brow furrowed in confusion. Did he do something wrong in some way? I sighed, pulling her close again, but she seemed to understand the simplicity of that concept, despite the complexities raging underneath. In the weeks that followed, we started to rebuild our little family of two, and with Evan's financial settlement, I was able to secure a fresh start and a comfortable rental home. Away from the shattered remnants of our marriage, I enrolled Zoe in a new school and realigned my career trajectory in marketing communications. Slowly, smiles and warmth began returning to Zoe's youthful exuberance as our new normal solidified, no longer weighed down by that toxic undercurrent of dysfunction surrounding Evan and Mara. The only hiccup came when I received a communication from Sienna Evans's former mistress, the woman he had intended to breed his hair with. "Your pathetic excuse for a husband came crawling back in case you were wondering." Her message read acidly, but once I got a taste of his true self and that monster-in-law, I wanted no part of that dysfunctional freak show. She included documentation showing the exorbitant settlement she had demanded to preserve her silence and disappear from our lives for good, a final insult to injury paid for my share of the divorce payout. Rather than anger, I felt only pity for Sienna's sad delusion that she'd been anything more than a dispensable pawn in Avon and Mara's twisted schemes, and I sensed her message held far more impact for them than for me, the ultimate failure and rejection of their disastrous heir-breeding plot. In a strange way, it felt like the last fading embers of that ugliness had finally burnt out completely, freeing me to turn my energy fully toward nurturing and protecting the family. I did have my ethereal bond with Zoe. There were still the occasional flare-ups from Mara's camp, grotesque tantrums lamenting her loss of control and grandchild, but I simply systemized blocking and containing her, preserving peace for Zoe at all costs. A few months after the finalized settlement, I received an awkward, rambling text from Evan out of the blue. "I know I have no right to darken your life any longer. The wreckage left behind is entirely my shame to bear, but I hope one day Zoe will understand that despite everything, I did love her with all my heart." The words were a hollow echo, a desperate grasp for validation or absolution after his spinelessness shattered our family. Didn't bother responding, focused entirely on my new beginning, because that broken man's sad plea for sympathy couldn't reach me any longer, not in a sanctuary of tranquility and love I had rebuilt around my beautiful daughter. Not when his vile deeds had finally caught up to him, leaving him utterly alone with his unbearable guilt. The years passed with surprising tranquility as I raised Zoe in our new peaceful life. There were moments of struggle and heartache, of course, but they paled in comparison to the constant toxicity that pervaded my marriage to Evan as she grew into a brilliant, self-assured young woman. I made sure Zoe understood the basic truths of what tore our family apart, at least enough for her to recognize the inherent brokenness in her father and grandmother's value system. She never voiced resentment toward them, but a sort of detached pity, an intrinsic understanding of how their obsessive pursuit of an heir destroyed any possible bond. "I'm just glad I had you." Mom would say, "You were the only one who truly knew what was important. Family, not bloodlines," with a maturity beyond her years. Her words filled me with pride and deep sadness for the innocence she was forced to let wither at such a young age, but I took comfort in the knowledge that I had shielded her from the brunt of their viciousness until the day that seismic postscript arrived, brutally textured with karma's fury. It was a simple certified letter that looked innocent at first glance, but the return address, a maximum security prison, quickly chilled me. I trembled and tore it open to discover a terse, stark message. "Mrs. Reading, I regret to inform you that your former husband, Avon Reading, has been incarcerated on charges of corporate racketeering, embezzlement, and tax evasion related to his business activities." The legal proceedings continued, but my vision blurred as the full weight landed on Evan, who was going to prison for upwards of 10 years, his career and reputation. Utterly elated in the wake of those charges, just like I had threatened all those years ago, with my hidden evidence of thermonuclear strike I'd hoped would never truly be detonated, clearly authorities had dug deeper in the aftermath of our brutal divorce and uncovered the full crater of his financial chicanery The sick twist of satisfaction I felt soared in an instant, replaced by a mix of stunned dismay and something worse, something deeper, remorse and empathy I didn't want to feel for that wretched man, because no matter how unforgivable his actions, no matter how much he deserved punishment, I knew this development would utterly shatter Mara. Her whole world, her whole cancerous obsession for continuing the family empire through a male heir would finally collapse in on itself. With Evan incarcerated, she would be alone, bereft, her manipulative power machinations reduced to ashes at last. I tried to stamp out the small tendril of compassion warming through me, reminding myself of her boundless cruelty and her eagerness to obliterate my own family. Yet it persisted, the ghost of the hopeful young bride. I had once been sickened by the realization that Mara had doomed herself and her deepest desire through her very quest to obtain it. Her worldview had been her undoing. The ramifications, of course, would ripple out in unpredictable waves. What would become of their real estate empire and wealth with Evan behind bars? And, more urgently, what about Zoe? I was deep in thought, rereading the letter for any clues, when the front door opened and my now-grown daughter swept in from classes. "Hi, Mom, did you hear from her?" She stopped short, taking in my pale, shaken expression. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" Drawing a steadying breath, I wordlessly handed her the letter. Zoe's eyes rapidly scanned the contents, her brows shooting upward in disbelief. "Oh my God, Dad's in prison." She looked up at me, the shock and hurt palpable despite our long estrangement from Evan. I moved to pull her into a comforting embrace, stroking her hair just like when she was little. "I know, honey, I know it's a lot to process." She held me close for a long time, and I could feel her swirling thoughts sinking like sediment through murky waters. Eventually, she pulled back her eyes, her voice steady, and her warm smile crackling with that resilient spirit inherited from her mother's DNA. Maybe this could be the end of it all, a fresh start free from his shadow and her poison for good. I looked at her with a lot of pride and love, overcome by the wise perseverance blazing in her young eyes. She was right. As the monolithic shockwave propagated outward, even behind bars, Mara's world collapsing, and we stood together on solid ground, free and unshaken. Perhaps this was the final cosmic realignment, setting the scales permanently, even drawing my brave, beautiful daughter close. Last but not least, Avon and Mara had staked all on deceit and power lust, unintentionally digging their own grave. However, in their loss and self-destruction, I had overcome my silent fortitude, and my love bond with Zoe had won the generational war. My only remaining remarks were that they were entitled. The same people I had growled at Mara so many years ago were the ones whose kingdom had fallen to dust. Never again come near me or my daughter once more, since it would be permanent this time.